Soil strength, especially the peak strength, can be influenced by various factors, including time under pressure as well as temperature. However, the relationship between these factors and the peak soil strength is not fully understood. This may be due to the difficulty in experimental procedure or the lack of foreseeable uses outside the lab for this process. The aim of this research report is to comprehensively analyse the influence of time and temperature on the peak strength of soil. This is useful, as soil peak strength can be used in engineering design. Peak soil strength is useful in calculating the loading capacity and earth pressure acting on retaining surfaces. Landslides and mining disasters can occur when peak soil strength is not taken into consideration for design. Consequently, the influence of time and temperature on peak soil strength must be considered in these developments. This research report will include several components to analyse the factors' influence on peak soil strength. Initially, a global literature review will be undertaken in order to gain a broader understanding of change in peak soil strength at different times and different temperatures. After this, a comprehensive analysis of experimental data and theories will be completed, and the effectiveness of these will be illustrated with real-world and theoretical examples. A laboratory experimental procedure and future uses of the relationship will also be proposed. Overall, this report will clarify the relationship between the peak strength of soil and the temperature and the time soil is under pressure. Peak soil strength with respect to time and temperature has been extensively researched and discussed in scientific papers and reports. Relevant literature is reviewed and analysed in this section. Wu has extensively researched soil strength and soil peak strength, and a relatively clear summary of his work is available in Landslides, Investigation and Mitigation. In the chapter Soil Strength Properties and Their Measurements, Wu summarises the key equations in determining stress in regards to cohesion, pore pressure, the angle of internal friction, void pressure, and principal stresses. He also explains that there is a relationship between undrained soil strength and the rate of loading, depending on the material. Finally, Wu describes tests that are useful for determining the peak strength of soil at a specific time. Uckel and Baldi in 1990 developed a temperature rate dependent plastic flow rule for clays. The article, titled Thermoplasticity of Saturated Clays, Experimental Constitutive Study, deduced that the strength of clay is moderately impacted by its temperature. The strength of overconsolidated clay was seen to decrease with temperature, whereas the opposite was seen to be true in normally consolidated clays. Segui et al. Explored the relationship between the basal temperature and the stability of a landslide. They determined that the fault point of a landslide can be determined by observing the temperature inside the landslide. This is because, as the landslide creeps, the temperature of the clay is raised until it becomes unstable and collapses as a landslide. As such, they successfully determined that real-world applications of the relationship between soil temperature and soil strength exist.
In a paper published by J.K. Mitchell, Associate Professor at the University of California, and D.R. Hooper, Civil Engineer, KZA Engineers International, the issue of mixing and compaction on properties of a lime-stabilized expansive clay with respect to time was discussed. Titled Influence of Time Between Mixing and Compaction on Properties of a Lime-Stabilized Expansive Clay, the analysis was carried out on expansive clays commonly found in California. Prior to the research, it was accepted that the soil with the lime stabilizer was not time-reliant when measuring its properties. However, it was found that for lime-stabilized expansive clay, the time delay between mixing and compaction had a negative effect on the strength of the soil, falling by about roughly 30%, along with other soil properties. The delay measured for this was 24 hours. In post-peak actual compressive strength and deformation behavior of fine-grained frozen soils by R.C. Joshi and H. Wijidarira from the Department of Civil Engineering, the University of Calgary, examined the behavior of post-peak compressive strength of frozen soils in accordance to the change of temperature conditions, along with total water content and dry unit weight of the soil. In their study, it was found that soils with temperatures close to freezing and low total water contents had a ductile deformation. On the other hand, soils close to freezing and with high total water contents, it was observed that the soil was brittle. Other than peak compressive strength, residual compressive strength was also studied. Taking into account all frozen soils measured, an empirical relationship was found for the ratio of peak compressive strength to the residual compressive strength, which decreases as the dry unit weight increases. A study carried out by two companies in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, by J.F. Nixon and J.M. Oswald, analytical solutions for peak and residual uplift resistance of pipelines, found that pipelines lift due to frost heave, which are laid across non-permafrost terrain. The stress found in the pipeline is partly due to a function of the soil strength on the non-heaving side of the frozen/unfrozen interface. Their study forced three solutions to be pursued, with the pipeline thought to be a strip footing, punching shear, and horizontal crack forming. It was found through these three solutions that the peak uplift resistance, the peak strength, and the residual uplift resistance were separate and did not rely on each other and were controlled by differing factors. One of the main contributing factors to the peak uplift resistance of the pipeline was the soil temperature, whereas the residual uplift resistance did not rely on the soil temperature as much.
In Li, Ling, and Sheng's elastoplastic behavior of frozen soils subjected to long-term, low-level repeated loading, Part 1, experimental investigation, and Part 2, constitutive modeling, a variety of triaxial tests were carried out on frozen soils. These frozen soil samples were subjected to low-level repeated loading over a long-term period. The amount and direction of accumulated strain resulting from the long-term loading was studied. Data from this experiment were used to develop a constitutive model of the behavior of the frozen soil samples when exposed to long-term vibrations in response to a recent geotechnical issue. An increase in the construction of railways, highways, and wind power plants in cold regions of China has exposed foundations to continuous vibrations that has resulted in permanent displacements being observed in field measurements, which could lead to eventual structural damage. Samples were initially subjected to axial and confining stresses applied in the axial and lateral directions for 10 minutes before imposing an additional repeated stress, the amplitude of which was varied, simulating a sinusoidal wave to implement cyclic loading. The loading cycle exceeded 1,000 repetitions. It was observed that as the number of loading cycles increased, the plastic shear strain also accumulated for all samples, but with a decreasing accumulation rate as peak strength was reached. The results from this study are applicable to construction projects in cold regions and can inform engineers of how soil is likely to behave under duress from long-term loading in alpine conditions. Suzuki, Fujimoto, and Taguchi's peak and residual strength characteristics of cement-treated soil under different consolidation conditions discusses how varying curing times for cement-treated soil affects peak strength. Using consolidated undrained triaxial compression testing, mixed fine-grained sand and Portland cement samples were analyzed. The samples have varying consolidation pressures, curing times, and delayed loading times. It was found that the undrained peak shear strength will increase with an increase in curing time, but decrease with an increase in the delayed loading time. The results of this research can be applied to various geotechnical engineering applications, including preparing unstable foundations for construction work to understand how to enhance soil properties for construction of long-life structures.
The pore pressure and peak soil strength are directly related through the following equation. The effective pressure is equal to the total pressure in the soil minus the pore pressure in the soil. The pore pressure in the soil is directly related to temperature through the ideal gas law, which is shown here. This can be rearranged and the pore pressure can be inserted so that pore pressure and temperature are directly related. Through these equations, the temperature and peak strength of soil are directly related.
Triaxial shear strength testing will need to be undertaken to observe the effect of time on soil peak strength. Cyclic loading can be implemented upon various soil types to observe how soils behave under long-term loading and to determine the peak strengths various soils reach under these conditions and at which point of time during the cycle. The effect different time variables have on peak strength when an admixture is added to a soil can also be examined. The formulas listed will be used to calculate the peak strength of the soil samples in conjunction with the standard triaxial testing procedure.
In influence of time between mixing and compaction on properties of a lime-stabilized expansive clay, the main test used was that of an unconfined compression test, using a strain rate of 0.127 centimeters per minute. The results from this test can be observed in Figure 1, which is presented on the left-hand side of the slide, here. For the second paper, the study of post-peak actual compressive strength and deformation behavior of fine-grained frozen soils, the main test used for this test was the uniaxial compression strength test. The sample was deformed laterally when being compressed without limited restraint. The temperature at which this test was done was between -5 and -17 degrees Celsius. Variables used in the test can be found in Figure 1 and Table 1 presented in the middle of this slide. The paper Analytical Solutions for Peak and Residual Uplift Resistance of Pipelines used 3 models which were based and derived on empirical relationships. The results of those 3 models can be found in Figure 5 presented on the right-hand side of the slide. In this figure, the models are compared at a temperature of -5 degrees Celsius. It was found that Model C governs for the most range of covered depths and would be the ideal solution to the problem presented by the pipeline uplift with regards to peak soil strength.
A triaxial compression test, with adjustments for temperature, can be used to measure the impact of temperature on soil peak strength. The test can be altered for all environments, including for different times under pressure. In situ tests were considered, however they were considered too impractical to measure temperature in the field due to the ever-changing conditions.
The peak shear strength of soil is often used by geotechnical engineers to determine the bearing capacity of foundations and to assess whether construction projects are viable. It is the geotechnical engineer's responsibility to ensure slopes, embankments, and retaining walls are stable. If the foundations are deemed unstable, any existing construction plans may have to be reconsidered or redesigned. Safety and expected lifetime of construction projects need to be considered extensively, as a failure in either will come under heavy scrutiny and could result in loss of life. It is critical that soils are able to resist failure when subjected to a multitude of forces and can withstand long-term loading from a structure. Landslides have been known to occur when the soil has possessed a lack of stability, and dam failures can occur if inadequate attention is paid to geotechnical elements of the dam design and its maintenance. Mines also require extensive geotechnical consideration, as any failure of the foundations can be catastrophic. This research report has determined that soil strength is influenced by temperature and time. This topic, which has been extensively researched, can be scientifically determined in a laboratory environment. In situ tests were not considered for this report because it would be more difficult to effectively control variables. Changes in soil temperature in the future could seriously impact infrastructure, especially regarding retaining walls and infrastructure that prevents landslides. Time also plays a significant role in soil mechanics and can be a major contributing factor in the success or failure of a structure. The desired outcome of this research will be to identify optimal time and temperature factors so maximum peak strength can be achieved, and to identify soil conditions which are likely to be problematic. With optimal peak strength, foundations will be more stable and the structures built upon those foundations will likely be safer and have a longer lifetime.